Hello, everyone, and welcome to the presentation on survivors with limited English proficiency and providing quality services to those survivors. I am Jada Charlie. I'm the president and CEO of Safe Homes Rape Crisis Coalition, and we provide services to victims of domestic and sexual violence in Spartanburg, Cherokee, and Union counties. So we're going to start with our objectives for today, which the first one, of course, is to learn about limited English proficiency. And the acronym we'll be using to shorten that phrase is LEP. And you may have heard of people who, you might say speak English as a second language or something like that. But the term that the federal government uses is limited English proficiency. Then we're also going to learn about the legal requirements and best practices for serving this population. And then we're going to learn how to use interpreters to work with clients with limited English proficiency, because that is a very specific skill for those interpreters to have. And just as a disclosure, I have not received any payment or benefit from this presentation, nor do I have a known conflict of interest in providing this information. So we are going to cover first who and what is LEP. So LEP is an acronym for Limited English Proficient or Limited English Proficiency. And that definition is for people who do not speak English as their primary language and who have a limited ability to speak, write, read, or understand English can be limited English proficient or LEP. So you might hear people joke sometimes, like, oh, she's from the South, her accent is so strong, she might be LEP, or, but it really means the primary definition is that people for whom English is not their primary language. So that is the federal government's definition of LEP or limited English proficiency. So why does it matter? It matters because 3% of the population in South Carolina, and that may not seem like a lot, but that is over 100,000 residents, speak English less than very well, which is the way the government defines limited English proficiency. In South Carolina, 4.3% of the population speak a language other than English at home. And as federally funded agencies and programs, we have an obligation to provide meaningful access to services for all people under federal law. What I say to people normally when they're trying to determine, am I able to speak with this client, even though English might not be their primary language? Can we converse in English? What I tell all the advocates and people that I work with, and what I also tell clients is, whatever language you would yell for help in. So if you were in a dangerous situation and you would yell for help, whatever language you would yell for help in is the language you should ask for services in, because the situation is inherently stressful. What we do at Safe Homes, I know, is very stressful, whether it's therapy or advocacy or shelter services, that person is finding themselves in a stressful situation. And so we don't want to add language as a barrier to be able to, a barrier to them getting services, or another thing or hoop that they have to jump through at an already stressful time. So to the extent that we can eliminate language as an issue for them, that's what we want to do. So if you're ever talking with someone and they're like, no, I'm fine in English, you can say, like, this is a really stressful situation. So, I want to make sure that you're understanding everything that I'm saying. And so if English is the language that you would yell for help in, then we can continue in English. But if it's not, please let me know what language that is, and we can get an interpreter on the line right now. Are there any questions about that? Okay. So this is pulled from the National Human Services Code of Ethics. So just give me a little emoji, like in the chat, or like put your hand up if you knew there was a National Human Services Code of Ethics. So I did not know either that there was a National Human Services Code of Ethics. But when I found it, I was like, oh, this is really wonderful. So in the National Human Services Code of Ethics, Standard 10 says that human service professionals, which would be most of us, well, all of us at safe homes, but most of us who work in this field serving victims of domestic or sexual violence. But human services professionals provide services without discrimination or preference in regards to age, ethnicity, culture, race, ability, gender, language preference, excuse me, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, nationality, or other historically oppressed groups. And Standard 26 says that human service professionals seek the training, experience, education, and supervision necessary to ensure their effectiveness in working with culturally diverse individuals based on age, ethnicity, culture, race, ability, gender, language preference, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, nationality, or other historically oppressed groups. In addition, they will strive to increase their competence in methods which are known to be the best fit for the populations with whom they work. So it is important for us as human service professionals to make sure that we are abiding by this code of ethics. And after the training, I'll make sure to put the link to the National Human Services Code of Ethics on the Safe Home SharePoint. I will also include it in the materials that get sent out to the IPV conference members as a part of this training. But I think that it's something that we should be aware of and train more on to the extent that we can. So if you look at these ethical standards and including language preference, that and ethnicity are a part of the limited English proficient services that we need to make sure that we're providing to clients. In addition to that, which, you know, the National Human Services Code of Ethics is a code. It is something that we are expected to adhere to, but it is not the law. But there is a law for providing services to people with limited English proficiency. And it's not a new law. It's been around for a long time. And that would be Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So like, give me an emoji or something in the chat or put your hand up if you realize that the limited English proficiency and protections around that actually are part of the landmark Civil Rights Act from 1964. Okay, cool. Some of you knew it, some of you are surprised. Okay, good. So what that means is that if you receive federal funds, that makes it illegal to discriminate against someone on the basis of national origin. And national origin discrimination includes discrimination against people who are limited in their ability to speak, read, or write English. And so the Office of Civil Rights in 2003 actually released guidance to assist federally funded programs. And that's programs like Safe Homes. You know, we receive federal grants. And that includes, for example, like the South Carolina court system receives federal money and has to abide by this. Local counties and municipalities receive federal money. And so they are required to provide services and not discriminate against people who are limited in their ability to speak, read, or write English. That includes most of our human services programs, whether we're talking about mental health, whether we're talking about homeless shelters or housing providers. Basically, if you receive federal funds, you have to provide services to people in their preferred language, and you cannot discriminate on their ability to speak, read, or write English. So it's a very protective law. I think that it's wonderful. I think that this is an example of, you know, the best parts of the law in the United States, because it really protects all of us, because we have United States citizens who might be limited English proficient. So it's not just limited to people who might immigrate here, or, you know, which it's wonderful for them too. But I think a lot of times we lose sight of the fact that we have citizens that might be limited English proficient and might need to access interpreter services as well. And many human services agencies in South Carolina have existing anti-discrimination policies, and many have come a long way to provide meaningful access. Some of you may know this about me, or you may not. My job when I was at Legal Services was making sure that legal services, attorney, all the services we provided as related to attorneys, to documents, to all of that all of our services were accessible to people with limited English proficiency. So this is a topic that's close to my heart, but that's just another example of an agency in our state that had to put a program in place to be able to provide meaningful access. So if you want to unmute yourselves, the barriers for LEP survivors can be lack of resources and language access services, such as interpreters and bilingual staff. It can be the failure of service providers to actually implement and enforce federally mandated language access policies. And it can also be prejudices, biases, and discrimination. Does anyone else have any, want to talk about any barriers that they've seen for survivors with limited English proficiency?
Even the resources that we've used, like Voyance, has been taxed a little bit, particularly with the Spanish-speaking population. So the wait time has been, we lose clients with the wait time.
That is so right, Marlene. Even when you are trying to abide by whatever your language access policy is, resources can sometimes be the problem. Also, it might just be ignorance, and I don't mean that in a mean way. I mean that people just don't know that they are required to provide this, and they may not know how to go about providing this. So it's very important that all of our agencies have a really thought out language access policy and have thought about what's going to be our plan A, what's plan B, what's plan C. So that's important to reduce the barriers for survivors with limited English proficiency, because we already know that many of these survivors actually are more reluctant to seek services. And so the more that we can eliminate language access as a barrier, we increase the likelihood that survivors will seek those services. And we also increase the likelihood that they'll continue with the services once they start. So factors that determine meaningful access, like what does meaningful access mean? And that's a law word, a legislative word. And so basically what you have to look at when you're trying to figure out what would meaningful access look like in this situation is the number or proportion of people with limited English proficiency in the community. So for example, in Spartanburg, we have one community, the Spanish-speaking community, that meets like the 5% threshold for translation of documents. But we also have really large Russian-speaking populations and a large population of people who speak Asian languages. And so when you're looking at how you're going to provide meaningful access in your community, the first thing that you can do is go to census. So you can go to census.gov and look at the data. You can drill down by county, by state, and look at, okay, what are the languages that are spoken in my area? And one of the things as a service provider that's interesting for me is to look through that list of languages and then compare it against the clients that we've served, and to see if we've encountered people who speak those languages, because that means that that's a blind spot for us. If we haven't, that might be a community where we need to go in and do some more outreach and really think about how we can impact that community. You also are going to want to look at the frequency of contact that your agency or program might have with the people with limited English proficiency. For example, if you're getting a large number of of clients who speak Hindi, but you're not providing services in Hindi and you don't have access to an interpreter, or you don't have access to translated documents in Hindi, you might want to look at that, because that person, even though it might not rise to a certain percentage in your community, if that population is accessing your services disproportionately, then you're going to want to still provide services in that target language. You also want to look at the nature and the importance of the benefit, the service encounter, the communication, the information, or service to the LEP person. And what does this mean? This means that when you're talking about things like 911, access with law enforcement, things that have life and death consequences, that's high, right? And so you're going to want to make sure that you have a language access program that addresses every language that might be present in your community and how you're going to address that, because that's dealing with life and death circumstances, or like a hospital, for example. That means for us at Safe Homes, the services that we provide are also important. We provide mental health services, we provide emergency shelter. So those services are so very important and provide such a high benefit that you want to consider making sure you're providing meaningful access to the people in your community. And then also, like with all things, you're going to want to measure the resources available to the program. And so that doesn't mean that you get to say, oh, we don't have enough money, so we don't provide interpreters. No, that's not what you get to say. What that means is that as you're writing your budgets for grants, it's important to include a line that says, translation and interpretation services, and include that in your budget in your grant request. That means that when you're doing your annual budget for your agency or for your municipality, whatever it may be, that there is a budget line item for translation and interpretation services, and that it is high enough and it recognizes the proportion of people with limited English proficiency in your community and the amount of contact that people with limited English proficiency are having with your program. So when I say, when you're considering the resources available, that's what's important. Now, also, we know that, there are, ways like you want someone to be able to communicate directly with that person, right? That's monolingual communication. And it would be wonderful for us if we could have a person at Safe Homes that spoke every language available in our community. We don't have that, unfortunately. And so even though monolingual communication in the target language is the best way, because we don't have that resource, we have to fall back on what's the next best way. And that would be, trained interpreters in the target language. So does anyone have any questions about that piece? Okay.
Jada, I do.
Yes.
You use the term interpreter and translator. Is there a difference?
Holly, you couldn't have asked that question at a better time.
Oh,
That is literally my next slide.
okay. I will wait patiently. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's like Amen, man. I appreciate that. Oh, that was old. I'm sorry. That was an old reference. But yeah. So what is the difference between your bilingual staff, your interpreters, and your translators? So when I was talking about that monolingual communication just now, that is done by bilingual staff. And so that is staff who are able to conduct the business of the workplace in at least 2 languages. So at Safe Homes, that would be Angela, it would be Jennifer, that would be Caroline. We have quite a few bilingual staff members at Safe Homes. And so that is wonderful because we're able to connect with clients directly in their language without having an interpreter present or on the phone to be able to assist clients. Interpreters are different. So interpreters may or may not work for your agency, but what interpreters do is they take the meaning from one language, which is the source language, and they interpret it into another orally. So an interpreter does spoken language. And in order to be an interpreter, you have to have command of at least 2 languages. And you have to be able to comprehend 2 languages, speak both languages, and choose an expression in the target language that fully conveys and matches the meaning of the source language. And I'll give you an example of why this is so difficult. In English, we use a phrase, and there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? Have you guys heard that? Or kill two birds with one stone. So those are idioms. And they're sayings that most English speakers would recognize. But if you are not a native English speaker, or you are not a person who has encountered enough English speaking and have enough fluency in English to understand those idioms, can you imagine what a nightmare those things would be to interpret? Like if you start talking about skinning cats in the middle of an appointment related to a doctor visit, you know, your client might be like, what is happening? Why are we now talking about harming cats? But an interpreter will actually take that idiom and think about an idiom in the target language that means the same thing, which is there's more than one way to accomplish our goal, is basically what you're trying to say. And they would then, you know, say that in the target language instead of literally interpreting there's more than one way to skin a cat. So interpretation is a very different skill set. And as talented as our bilingual staff is, and as hard as they work every day, interpreting is a skill that has to be trained and developed on its own. So when we ask our bilingual staff to interpret for us, it's really not fair to them unless they have been trained as interpreters, because it's a very different skill set to be able to interpret versus being bilingual and being able to just have your own conversation in the target language. Translators convey the meaning from written text to written text. Now, you may have an interpreter that has to take a document and look at it and convey the meaning orally to someone, but a translator will actually take that document and convey the meaning in another document in the target language. Translation, it requires different skills than interpretation, and they both have very different training regimens. So Holly, I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, let me know. But does anyone have any more questions about that? Okay. All right. So I know if I have had a long time to learn about this stuff, but those of us who are not as well versed, we may use interpreter and translator interchangeably. But there's a big difference because, like I just said, an interpreter is spoken, a translator is written, and they have very different skills. So if you're planning to have a spoken conversation, what you need is an interpreter. But if you want the document in another document in the target language, then what you're looking for is a translator. All right, so now we're gonna jump to specific skills to use with an interpreter. So please give me something in the chat or a little raised hand emoji if you've ever used an interpreter before. Okay, good. We got some people with some experience. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so now if you've used an interpreter before and it felt awkward because maybe they were in person and you didn't know where the interpreter should sit or where you should sit, or maybe the client talked for a really long time and then the interpreter interpreted and it was like 2 sentences, but the client had been talking for like 2 minutes. Or maybe your client kept talking to the interpreter, like trying to have a conversation with the interpreter because it was, you know, the language familiarity was there. And so you couldn't understand what they were saying. Or like you just walked in and you knew the person was limited English proficient and you knew you had an interpreter, but you didn't really know how to start the meeting or start the session. Has that happened to anybody? It's happened to me, definitely. So has it happened to anybody else? But also I'm an awkward person, so it could just be me. It could just be me. Okay. So hopefully what I'm about to teach you now will help when you're having to deal with an interpreter and dealing with a client with limited English proficiency. So there are 3 key concepts to using an interpreter effectively. And that is speaking in chunks, making a personal connection, and then managing the conversation. So we'll talk about speaking in chunks first. So I want to play a little game. Will somebody volunteer to unmute themselves and play this game with me?
I will.
Okay. All right, Elizabeth. So let's go. I am going to say a little paragraph, and then I want you to repeat exactly what I'm saying, okay?
Okay.
Okay. So my name is Jada Charlie. I work for Safe Homes Right Prices Coalition, and I'm coming to you today to talk about clients with limited English proficiency. We may have had some problems in the past about serving these clients because we didn't know what to do, but hopefully now we'll know what to do. And we're going to develop some policies and parameters around serving these clients to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes that we made in the past.
Yeah, that's too much.
All right.
I mean, yeah, like you can get like the first part, but yeah, that's entirely too long.
Right, exactly. So when we're thinking about interpreters, right? So what they're doing is they're listening to a spoken message in one language and converting it into a spoken message with the same meaning in another language. So they have to listen, they have to remember what was said, and then they have to convert the spoken message with the same meaning in another language. And that's hard. That is a lot of brain power. If interpreters were computers, that's around the time that the fans would start worrying because that computer is doing a lot of work. So how can you, as a participant in the conversation, help make the job easier? And that is to speak in chunks. So speaking in chunks is something we actually do naturally, but it's very important when you're doing it with an interpreter. The longer someone speaks before pausing, obviously, the more difficult it is for an interpreter to remember. And we just witnessed that with Elizabeth and I, and that wasn't even in a different language, that was in English. And so when the interpreter can't remember everything, important details may be left out. So you may already be familiar with the solution of chunking. One of the ways we've all seen it is when couples exchange wedding vows, and you can watch the officiant will say like, you know, I Jada, take you Tiff, right? And so when presidents take the oath of office, you've also seen speaking in chunks where the speaker reads a piece and then the person repeats it back. So you're doing the same thing with your interpreter. You're just speaking in short chunks. It's not necessarily a complete sentence, but it is a complete thought. So Elizabeth, if you'll play along with me again, we'll try it speaking in chunks, okay?
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jada Charlie, and I'm the director here at Safe Homes.
Hi, I'm Jada Charlie, and I'm the director here at Safe Homes.
And we're going to talk today about serving clients with limited English proficiency.
And we're going to talk today about clients with limited English proficiency.
So chunking makes it a lot easier. You just want to remember when you're speaking in chunks to speak clearly without rushing and do it in your normal conversational tone, just like you would if you were having a conversation with that person. Any questions about chunking? At first, it can feel kind of funny. It may feel a little stilted, but pretty soon you and your interpreter will get into a rhythm. Well, they will be able to anticipate where your stops are going to be. And so they'll already be ready to start interpreting once you pause. And that's really important because that helps with the flow of the conversation. It helps make sure nothing is getting left out. And it also helps speed up the session. Interpreting sessions, what I tell people, if you're going to use an interpreter at a minimum, double whatever time it normally takes. So if you normally have a 1 hour session and you're using an interpreter, make sure you book for 2 hours at a minimum because the interpretation does take time. But eventually you and your interpreter will get into a rhythm once you begin speaking in chunks. Are there any questions about that part?
I have a comment.
Okay.
I've noticed that when I'm on the phone, someone will be using an interpreter, and so I will be talking directly to the interpreter, and then I'm trying to direct them or let them know that I'm trying to get someone who can help them.
Okay.
And so I haven't previously had any interaction with interpreters up until this position. So it felt really weird. And it almost felt, I personally felt like it was I felt like I was demeaning them or something because I was just speaking really small and in simple phrases.
Mhm.
But I also felt, after what you've said so far, it's like, well, that's necessary. So there's no reason to feel like, it's demeaning.
Right. Right. Just
But
like
it is weird.
it is strange, but it just needs to be a complete thought. It doesn't have to be a complete sentence. And you don't have to feel like you have to dumb down what you're saying. So if you would tell an English speaking client like, sure, you can come by our office on Monday. Your appointment is at 9 o'clock. You would just then pause for the interpreter to say that. So
Okay.
it's different. It's different.
Mhm.
But I wouldn't advise dumbing down anything you said unless the client relayed, hey, I don't understand what you're saying. That
Okay.
would be different.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Um, and before I move off of this, I can't remember if I have a slide about that. But make sure when you're working with your interpreter that you use I statements. So you talk just as though you're talking directly to the client. So you wouldn't say, tell her I said that her appointment is at 9. You would just say, your appointment is at 9, right? Because if the interpreter is doing their job and you say, tell her I said her appointment is at 9, the interpreter is going to say in the target language, tell her I said the appointment's at 9. And then your client is going to say, tell whose appointment is at 9. And now you got a who's on first, what's on second situation. So just speak as though you're speaking directly to that person. And not tell her I said. It's just, hey, you have an appointment at 9 o'clock. Please show up. Your appointment's going to be with E. And E is our clinical director. Just directly to that person, just like you're talking to them. The other part of being awkward is how hard it is to make a personal connection. When you meet an English speaking person for the first time, or if you already know somebody, what do? You walk in, you act friendly, you're like, hey, how are you? Oh, can you believe all this rain we're having? You just have a little small talk. You may ask questions about them or their family, like, oh, how's the dog? And how's your baby? And it seems so easy and natural when it's in English, but when there's an interpreter present, we usually kind of clam up and just get right to business. But it's very important to make that personal connection with clients. So just imagine that they understand English. So if the interpreter is already present, however you would walk in, if that person speaks English, do that same thing. So ask about the dog, talk about the weather, ask how their baby's doing, check in with them. However you would normally act, do that. And that also helps establish the client's focus on you and not on the interpreter. And so the interpreter almost fades into the background and becomes just a way, just a tool for you and the client to manage the conversation. And you may be worried like, oh, that's offensive to the interpreter. But trained interpreters, that's what they want. They want to be, I would never say treat a person like a thing, like ever, right? But interpreters want to be a tool. And so they do kind of just want to fade into the background and allow that conversation to go forward. So it's important to make a personal connection the same way you would if that person understood English. So like I said, just greet people in English as if they understood. Focus your attention on them, and then they will focus their attention on you when they realize that your eyes are on them, that you're using first person language, all of that. Then that will naturally cause the client to have that reaction to you as well. And if you are normally friendly, cheerful, helpful, and interested, be that way. Still don't lose your personality just because the person does not speak English or is limited English proficient. if you're not normally friendly, cheerful, helpful, or interested, whatever you normally are, just keep that same energy when you are working with clients with limited English proficiency. So think of your interpreter as your voice in your ears. And so naturally, when we're looking at people, we're watching their mouth move when they talk. And so you want your voice and your ears close to you so that people will naturally look in your direction. So what I usually advise is if you have a in-person interpreter, that you kind of sit that person a little bit behind you and off to the side, just so that the client's natural line of sight falls towards you with, the interpreter right there. If you're using an interpreter over the phone, I usually try to situate the phone where the client should hear it, but then I don't look down at the phone. I look directly at the client for the entire meeting. And I don't focus on the phone. I just act like it's a tool that we're using to be able to communicate. So are there any questions about that? Okay. So this is what I just covered about positioning. If you're ever in a small group and you have an interpreter, seat your interpreter next to you, but just a little bit away from the table. So that the line of sight still naturally falls to you when the interpretation is happening. And we covered this already as well. You're not having a conversation with your interpreter. So, when you say, hi, my name is John, a professional interpreter will not say, he said his name is John. So like I said, just remember to use first person language. During your interpretation session, your interpreter may avoid eye contact with you and the client. That's normal. That's actually what professional interpreters are trained to do. So just remember to focus your attention on your client and to try to keep your client's attention focused on you to the extent possible. I know that when I started working with people with limited English proficiency, I was so afraid of making a cultural mistake. I was just so afraid of offending someone. I think we all may have a horror story about a time we did something that was completely culturally inappropriate. But I just want to reassure you that it takes years being immersed in a culture to learn all the rules of behavior. Y'all might have heard me talk before about how important it is to have people at safe homes who are not just bilingual, but also bicultural. I am bilingual. I am not bicultural. So it's important to have people that do understand the culture, but you don't expect everybody that you're talking to know all of your cultural rules. So similarly, clients don't expect us to know all of their cultural rules. But I have learned that if you are genuinely interested and genuinely friendly and trying to be helpful, then people will recognize what you are trying to do and appreciate it, and they won't hold a cultural mistake against you. If you have the opportunity to meet with your interpreter in advance to ask questions, you can get advice on, whatever difficult cultural situations you may be focusing. What we do at Safe Homes is so very sensitive that, it might be good to try to debrief with someone from that culture ahead of time if you're meeting with a client who has a culture different from your own, to just get a feel about if there's anything you should avoid, if there's a certain way that you should say things, so that you can just have as much information as possible to try to make the client as comfortable as possible. But you can't learn all the cultural rules in a debriefing session. So you're probably gonna make a mistake. I'm just gonna be honest with you. It's okay though. It's okay. Acknowledge the mistake, ask for forgiveness sincerely, and then just move on. Just move on. So are there an example of this outside of limited English proficiency might be like we've probably had a lot of experience with the LGBTQ population and using pronouns. And so sometimes you may use the wrong pronoun for someone. If they just correct you, just acknowledge it, just say, okay, I'm so sorry. And moving forward, use the correct pronoun. So that's like a cultural mistake. That's something that you may have done, acknowledge the harm And the way to repair it going forward is to do your best to use the pronouns that they've asked for. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Managing a conversation with an interpreter is very difficult. You have multiple people in the room. So you have to be very alert to problems and issues that can arise. And it's your job as the facilitator of the conversation to make sure that the conversation keeps flowing smoothly. So side conversations. So this has happened to me a lot where you might have another person in the meeting that also speaks English that wants to have a side conversation with you, or you might have someone walk in your office while you are meeting with the person with limited English proficiency, and that person walks in, says something that if an English speaker had been there, the English speaker would have heard and understood it. So the way to manage these side conversations is to make sure that everything gets interpreted. So if a side conversation begins, so usually if someone walks into my office, I'll ask them like, hold on a second, and I will look to the interpreter and say, please make sure to interpret whatever they say. And if that person was going to come into my office and say something inappropriate with that person present, they'll usually say, oh, it's okay, Jada, I'll be back. I'll just come back and talk to you later. And the interpreter will say, oh, it's okay, Jada, I'll just come back and talk to you later. So that's a way to, make sure that we are treating our clients with limited English proficiency with the same respect that we would show our clients who are English speaking. So also, if the person walks in and has a problem with that, it's okay to just explain that side conversations make people feel uncomfortable or feel left out. So just ask people in your meeting, and you yourself need to make a point to avoid side conversations. People rambling on. So I'm guilty of this, and some of the survivors we assist may be doing this as well. You've taken this training, so you understand speaking in chunks, why we should do it. But guess who doesn't know that? Your clients or other participants to the conversation. So what can you do? Interrupt politely, okay? Interrupt politely. So when, like, let's say someone is, going on and on, it's okay to say to the client, I'm just gonna ask you to pause right here to let the interpreter interpret. The interpreter will interpret that and then interpret what the client said. And so it's okay. Just, when you feel like, okay, this has gone on a little long for the interpreter to be able to interpret. And a lot of times you can just give people visual cues. A lot of times I would just like lift my hand up and just kind of like ask people to just pause for a minute to let the interpreter interpret. And then when they realize that that's what you're doing, guess what? They pick up on the rhythm and they will start engaging in that rhythm themselves. Any questions about that? Okay. So when we don't have professional interpreters available, using what we've learned in this training will make it easier, but there are still potential pitfalls to using untrained interpreters. Being bilingual is a wonderful skill, but it does not automatically make someone an interpreter. So if you are asking your bilingual colleagues to interpret, they're not going to be able to interpret like a professional because they have not been trained to do that. When you are looking for an interpreter, ask about their training and experience, not just with the language, but with the interpretation and the type of interpreting that's going to take place. For example, at the hospital, the interpreters that they use have to have training in medical interpretation. You have to know how to say things like spleen in the target language, which is not a word that many of us know. I know, like I said, I consider myself bilingual. I don't know how to say spleen in Spanish. So it's important that if you are using a medical, like if you're going to do medical interpreting, if it's going to be interpreting where you're talking about things like sexual assault or a lot of legal terms or just terms that people may not use in their everyday, make sure you talk to your interpreter to make sure that they know those words and are able to interpret those words into the target language. You want to make sure that your interpreter is a good fit. We just covered what type of language skills and vocabulary you might need to have. Many bilingual speakers don't have equal skills and vocabulary in both languages. So that's what really makes it hard for them to act as interpreters. And they also may have different regional variations. You know, if they have learned Spanish in one country and we are asking them to interpret Spanish from another country that has a very different dialect, that might be hard for them. Even though they understand the language, they may have a different fluency in that dialect or different fluency in their native language. So once again, let's not ask our bilingual staff to act as interpreters. So who on this call can tell me SCADVASA? What does SCADVASA stand for?
The South Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault.
Absolutely correct. Do you think anybody who didn't engage with our work or wasn't fluent in issues around sexual and domestic violence would know what the acronym SCADVASA stood for?
No, ma'am.
Right. Right. So every organization has specialized vocabulary, everyone. And we use this specialized vocabulary every day. E might say, you know, Jada, we need to go to a training on TFCBT. And I may look at E because I'm not a therapist and say, E, what? I'm sorry, what? What does that mean? But in E's clinical department, that's a commonly used acronym. That's a well-known training. So it's easy to forget that a bilingual speaker and maybe even a professional interpreter may not know this vocabulary in one or both languages. So what you want to do to the extent possible is do your best to avoid or at least explain industry-specific terms or acronyms or ordinary words. So if you're say like, oh, I provide services to SA victims, like what does SA mean? If I didn't work in this field, I wouldn't know what that means. So to the extent you can avoid acronyms or explain what they are, make sure you're doing that when you're using your interpreter as well. If you're going to be using specialized vocabulary, when you do your initial consultation with your interpreter, if it's possible, just let them know what that specialized vocabulary might be. Okay. We may encounter this often, conflicts of interest. So I've had clients express to me that they would prefer to see an English speaking person in our agency instead of our like the person we have in our agency that speaks their language. And so, you know, when you ask why, it's because we all have our own networks. We all have friends, we all have acquaintances, and it may be that the network for that particular language is so small that they don't want a member of that network to know what's going on with them. So that might be a potential conflict of interest if that person knows them or knows something about them. And now that's not saying anything about the staff at Safe Homes, because I know that you all keep it 100% confidential all the time, but clients don't know that. And that may make them uncomfortable. So, you know, you have to be aware of your, you know, bilingual colleagues maybe having potential conflicts of interest. Also, this is a separate advocacy point. When we meet with clients, we need to do it without anyone present, even if it's something that someone that the client brought with them. We don't know what that person's interest might be. And I'll just give you an example. I have 2 children, and both of my children are about to be out of my house. And so I don't want any more children. But my mom, I'm my mom's only child, and my mom, like, it has baby fever, and I don't know why. And so if I were to go to my OBGYN and I brought my mom in, and let's say I didn't speak English, but my mom did. And so my OBGYN, you know, will look at me and say, hey, why are you here today? And you know, I might say to my mom in my native language, like, let him know I'm here for birth control. And my mom is going to look at the OBGYN and say, she's here for fertility drugs. So you never know what someone's conflict of interest might be. Make sure that you're meeting with clients by themselves or with just the interpreter. It's okay to ask your client, you know, do you know the interpreter? Are you comfortable with this interpreter being here? And if the interpreter has like a connection with the client, if things start going, you know, becoming difficult for the client or the conversation becomes adversarial for some reason, the interpreter may be tempted to act as an advocate instead of as an interpreter, which can derail the whole conversation. So the greater the likelihood that your conversation may involve confidential information or become adversarial, the greater your need for a neutral interpreter. Any questions about that? So I'll just give an internal example. If I'm going to provide advocacy services to a Spanish-speaking client that Jen is seeing for therapy services, I don't want Jen to act as my interpreter for those advocacy services because she has a different relationship with that client. She needs to maintain her relationship and the way that that works with the client. And so it's better for me to get a person in Safe Homes who's not affiliated with that client or to use a professional interpreter.
But if they requested Jennifer, that would be okay.
Actually, no.
No, okay.
No, we would have to explain to them, like, I can understand why you would want Jennifer to act as an interpreter, but at our agency, Jennifer's responsibility is to be your therapist. And so we want to make sure that on the advocacy side that we are not crossing any of those lines. So we are going to have Angela work with you, or we're going to have Jada work with you with an interpreter.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Good question, Elizabeth. Okay. Before you use an untrained interpreter under the circumstances where that might be necessary, make sure you consider the consequences of an interpreting error. So if you are calling a client to inform them about their hearing, you want to make sure that the person that is interpreting for you understands times, dates, and locations to be able to explain that to the client well. Usually, if I'm using an interpreter and I'm giving something like court hearings, I will make sure that I say it 3 times in the conversation, and I will ask the client to repeat it back to me so that the interpreter can tell me what the client said so that I can confirm that they actually have down what I am telling them to do. If the conversation can lead to significant consequences for the organization or the participants in the organization, that's when you want a professional interpreter, even if you have to reschedule the meeting. Or if the conversation is going to have significant consequences for the client. When we're doing OPs, that's why it's so important for us to make sure that we put that interpreter request into the order of protection paperwork when we file it, because the consequences of not getting an order of protection can be significant. So that's just an example. So think about the consequences of a miscommunication or a misunderstanding, and the greater the consequences, the greater your need for skilled interpreters. Okay, I have a whole slide about using children as interpreters, but here's the summation. Don't do it, ever. It's not okay, ever. Under no situation is it okay. It is not fair to ask children to do an adult's job. It is not fair to expect children to be trained in something that adults don't have training in. Interpreters work for years to learn their craft and to be good at their craft. We are asking children to do that. We are putting children in some of the most untenable situations when they themselves are also experiencing whatever stress our client is experiencing. So don't do it, ever, ever, ever. Any questions about that? Okay. All right. So we talked a little bit about having a pre-session with your interpreter that will allow you to agree on your game plan. You just only need to do this if it's possible, if it's not an emergency situation, If you're using an in-person interpreter, I know with Voyance, we may not have the opportunity to do that. Sometimes if I know a client is coming in for an appointment, because we also used Voyance when I was practicing, I will call Voyance, go ahead and get the interpreter on the line, maybe, 3 or 4 minutes before I bring the client in, and just kind of say to the interpreter, hey, today we're going to be talking about evictions and foreclosure. We're going to be talking about scheduling her court hearing, and we're going to be talking about this. Are these things that you feel like you have the vocabulary to interpret, or anything like that? My client is from El Salvador. Is that a dialect of Spanish that you feel comfortable speaking? So you can do that with Voyance. Like I said, just call about 2 minutes before you bring the client back, get your interpreter on the line, kind of brief the interpreter, and that's for in-person meetings. I know that when we're using Voyance for Crisis Line, we don't have this opportunity, and that's okay. So I know that we talk a lot about cultural competency. Cultural competency does not exist. You cannot be competent in someone's culture, but cultural humility is the goal. And so what that means is you are always learning, reflecting, practicing, and being curious about someone else's culture and identity. You are doing your very best to not attach your preconceived notions and biases to what this individual's actions may mean. And it's hard. It's a hard thing to do. That's why it's called cultural humility, because it really requires us to kind of step outside of our feelings and how it's affecting us, and be very humble and acknowledge, I have to learn about this person's culture, and I have to learn through them how their culture is shaping their experience and the experience that they're having with me. I could do a whole training on cultural humility. I just wanted to hit it as a bullet point here. But please, we as an agency, we as service providers should strive to have cultural humility, and not so much cultural competence. You're not going to learn everything about anybody's culture, especially not in the short window of time that we're working with them. So that's why it's important to practice cultural humility. Any questions about that? Okay. So how do we strengthen intercultural communication skills? The same way we strengthen intracultural communication skills. So building trust, being open, being patient, maintaining a neutral position, listening, attaching, like paying attention to nonverbal communication, but don't attach your meanings to it, right? Just take a note, just say, wow, whenever I bring up this topic, she starts shifting around. I'm curious about that, right? But don't attach your meaning to it. Be aware of your own frame of reference and that of others. Express empathy, question your assumptions, and be aware of your stereotypes, biases, and prejudices. In terms of questioning assumptions, one of the biggest cultural lessons I learned had nothing to do with limited English proficiency, but it had everything to do with, I had a client who was consistently late for meetings. And so I attached my own meaning to that, which is she's not respectful of my time. I mean, I keep scheduling these appointments, and then she's rescheduling and she's missing them, or she's showing up late, still expecting to get to meet with me for the whole time. And so I finally, just out of frustration, asked a question, and it was, Miss So-and-so, why are you always late? Like, why are you always late to our appointments? And she said, well, Miss Charlie, my car got repossessed. And so now I have to catch a ride to come, and nobody is ever coming downtown. So, some of the people I rely on, I can't really rely on because they don't travel this far. And so that for me was a moment where I had to say, oh, okay, I attached a whole different meaning to this than what was actually true. And if I had just been curious about it from the beginning, then I could have not made her feel so uncomfortable and not been so upset with her all this time. So that's just an example of how important it is not to attach our own meaning to things. one of the, the easiest ways is to identify the similarities and differences between ourselves and the client and how that might affect issues of trust. One of the things I realized when I was practicing is that when I would meet with clients, I would schedule a certain amount of time, and then I would be like, okay, like I got to wrap this meeting up because I've run out of time. But I was the first person that the client felt like was in a position of authority that listened to them. And so I had to acknowledge that that was the role that was being placed on me by those clients. And I had to leave space for that role. So that meant I had to stretch out the appointment time to allow them, a little more time to be able to talk to me, to feel like they were heard. And so think about that when you're thinking about how you're interacting with clients from different culture, especially clients with limited English proficiency. How does the culture of the courts, the legal system, the hospital system, all these systems that we're so accustomed to interacting with, think about how that might look from the client's chair. When you are, when we're thinking about serving clients, and we talked about this in one of our other trainings, is what does this look like from the client's seat? If I were a client, how would this affect me? So thinking about that, especially when you're talking about interacting with culturally diverse clients, working with interpreters in ways that enable the development of communication, identifying red flags when the interpretation of the interaction is not going well, and then thinking through what steps can I take to improve this interaction or improve this interpretation. If your agency does not already have a plan to accommodate people with limited English proficiency, there are a multitude of plans available on the internet. I'm willing to send ones that I have developed and worked with, and that's important. So the first step is to have a plan, train on your plan, hire bilingual staff, and train your staff, your frontline staff that's going to be using the interpreters on the phone line, how to do that well, and what your agency's language access policy is. Make sure that you connect survivors with services offered in their first language to the extent possible, and then partner with other community organizations like Parent Smart, First Steps, churches and housing programs that serve the limited English proficient population to share what resources exist with each other. Here's a list of websites where you can get more information about working with people with limited English proficiency and the laws related to that. And then the real takeaway, what I want you to take away from this and marinate on is, what can we start to do in our community to ensure that every survivor has equal access to services, advocacy, and support? And that's really the feedback that I am interested in receiving. Here are some of the references I referred to earlier. This one from the New York City Education Department is their language access plan, which is about as comprehensive one as I've ever seen. You can imagine all the languages spoken in New York. And then we've got lep.gov and census.gov. And that is the end of my presentation. If we have any questions, we'll take them now. If there are no questions, I'm going to stop recording.
I have a question.
Oh yeah, sure, go ahead.
And I'm sorry, I came in a few minutes late and you may have addressed this already, but one of the things that I've wondered about is when somebody calls in to the office, the crisis line, and they don't speak English,
Mm-hmm.
Do we have something, or do you know a good place to get something to help us let them know that we are about to try to connect them with an interpreter?
So we actually have a training scheduled, that's called Voyance and Working with Interpreters. That's just going to be our agency training. And part of that is a hold please training. So we will have sheets available to try to, and it's got like the phonetic spelling for how to say hold please in several languages. So hopefully that will answer your question more in depth and actually give us what we need.
Great.
Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to stop